goes and grabs that AK-47, hides in a point in that space that you're about to enter. You don't get to choose if you keep going. The bullet does. The likelihood is that their deaths would have been prevented if they stuck to our original methodology. He says, look, what's supposed to happen is dynamic entry. What never happens is dynamic entry.
118, tell this my family all over. I can't copy. I can't tell our family all over. We got crews coming.
Welcome back to the Surviving the Street podcast, where policing meets personal growth, tough conversations, and partially filtered stories of real events. Nir Maman, thanks for being on the podcast today.
It's great to be here with you, brother.
Nir reached out to me through an email, which turned into a conversation over the phone for about 2 hours. This was maybe 3 weeks ago. We've been in contact since then, and he initially reached out to me because he thought that some of the videos that I was posting on YouTube were very relevant, and that was something that he wanted to discuss with me. After we had that conversation and subsequent conversations, we also decided that these conversations would be valuable to other members of the Surviving the Street community, or just other members that may come across, or individuals that may come across this podcast. Nir was born in Israel and lived between Canada and the United States. His professional background includes over 25 years of military, police, and security services in Israel, Canada, and the United States. In Israel, he served in the IDF Special Forces Counter-Terror Unit and held several positions in the Counter-Terror School. He was an operational team leader on the Counter-Terror Unit, responsible for carrying out various missions, including direct action missions, high-risk arrest operations of wanted terrorists, and response and intervention of active terror attacks and hostage incidents. While at the Counter-Terror School, Nir was in charge of the Hostage Rescue Section, responsible for training the IDF's designated hostage rescue units. Nir was also in charge of the International Joint Forces Training Section, where he was responsible for developing and delivering the training to all the U.S. SOCOM units, as well as all other allied nation military spec op units that would attend the IDF's CT school before deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan for the global war on terror efforts. Nir was appointed as the Counter-Terror School's designated subject matter expert for active terror attack intervention. Since October 7th, terror invasion into Israel, the IDF's war against Hamas, Nir has been in active combat reserve service in the IDF. He first served in the Light Infantry Combat Unit, carrying out various missions across Hebron in the Judea-Samaria West Bank region, including security posts, checkpoints, patrols, along with raids and arrest operations of Hamas and terror cells. Nir then transferred to a special operations unit responsible for search and destroy missions in Gaza, targeting Hamas, Pij, and other terror cell buildings and terror tunnels, as well as searching for hostages. Nir is currently assigned to 2 special operations units in his reserve duty. In Canada, Nir served in several capacities in law enforcement and critical infrastructure security, including nuclear, tactical, SWAT unit operator, patrol, and the use of force and tactical instructor at a police academy. Nir is currently a reserve deputy sheriff in the United States. Nir also has 25 years experience in the field of close protection and has been in charge of protecting politicians, corporate executives, and celebrities. Additionally, over the past 15 years, Nir has been retained to carry out the tactical rescue operations of individuals who were abducted and taken to volatile, high-risk regions around the world. Nir also has over 40 years of martial arts experience in Krav Maga, a 4th-degree black belt, Taekwondo, a 3rd-degree black belt, Hapkido, a 1st-degree black belt, and other martial arts. He developed a single-officer active shooter intervention methodology that has officially been adopted by the FBI SWAT teams and by FLET, which have been teaching his methodology to law enforcement community across the U.S. since 2009. To date, Nir has officially trained thousands of military special operations soldiers, police officers, and security agents around the world. We may or may not have just been recording for an hour and a half, and I did not hit record, which, if you've been listening to my podcast, for a period of time, you know that that's not the first time that I've done that, which kind of sucks, but we're here now, so we're going to jump right back into this. You've already heard Nir Maman's bio. I think this is a very important conversation, one, to have, but two, contrary to what I normally do, which is not really spend a lot of time on the guests themselves. I believe like him talking about who he is, what he's done, what his mission is, adds value, or the most necessary and needed value to this conversation. So Nir is going to go ahead and start wherever he wants to start. So it gives you a better idea of who he is, what he's about, and what he has to offer the community.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. So I'll start with a little bit about where I'm from and how I ended up doing what I do and where I am today. Because a lot of times people will have a look at my background and not believe that it is real. In the sense of, well, claims to be an Israeli, but he lives in Canada. Claims to be a Canadian, but he served in the U.S. And so let me put some order to that so everybody understands. I was born in Israel. We left Israel when I was 5. We actually moved to France for a year. We have a lot of family, and then moved to Canada. So I grew up in Canada since the age of 6, and finished my schooling here in Canada, and that's kind of where I started my journey, my professional journey. I had an incident when I was 12 years old where myself and my best friend at that time in middle school, we got swarmed by a group of about 25 neo-Nazi skinheads. Worst beating I ever took in my life, and that was the day that I decided that I was going to grow up to be big and strong and, black belts and everything, and special forces and policing, and become a protector. And so that's where my journey began. Martial arts, I've been training martial arts since about the age of 4. That came by virtue of the fact that I grew up into a family that has had martial arts running through our DNA. My father and his siblings trained in martial arts since they were very young, and my father kind of stuck to it, and was also a Krav instructor during his service in the IDF. And so, as far as martial arts, I have about 43 years under me right now. In Krav Maga, Taekwondo, I have a 4th-degree black belt in Krav Maga, 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo, 1st-degree black belt in Hapkido, and I also have been my whole life into Jeet Kune Do and Filipino martial arts. So that's already been kind of my baseline. And then when I finished high school, I started my journey back and forth between North America and Israel. So just to give a quick snapshot of my background in Israel, I served I started out in our northern command, the Golani Brigade. I then transferred over to our counter-terror unit, which is also our counter-terror school in the IDF, in charge of everything related to counter-terror warfare for the entire Israeli Defense Force. I held several positions during my service. I was the lead instructor in charge of the hostage rescue section for the counter-terror school. I was also the section commander in charge of our International Joint Forces Training Mission section. So we have had for a very long time a relationship with many countries around the world, allied nation countries that are involved in the global war on terror. Specifically with the United States Special Operations Command. So a lot of all their units would come to our counter-terror school for training before they deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. I was in charge of putting together all those programs and training them. So I worked with a lot of the world's elite units in that capacity, which was an incredible experience for me. I was assigned to our chief instruction section at the counter-terror school, where my job was to develop tactics, TTPs, methodologies pertaining to various threats or mission profiles that came up. And whenever we would have compromises in our tactics or methodologies in the field, my job would be to revamp those tactics. So we've had several instances, for example, where the various terror groups that we contend with would observe us to see what we're doing, document our tactics. They would bait us into situations where, while our units go in to actually address those situations, on the periphery, Hamas, Hezbollah, they're sitting there with binoculars and notepads or video cameras filming what we're doing. And then they would put together their tactics to counter what we do. And would have instances in the field where our units are getting, circumvented tactically. So my job would be to quickly remedy that issue with new tactics and methodologies. And with that, our unit is an operational counter-terror unit, and I was a team leader assigned to our operational side of the of the house. So our unit would be responsible for carrying out raids and arrests of wanted terrorists or terrorists that were about to deploy to commit a terrorist attack in Israel. We would also respond to active terror attacks that were going on. And we were also designated as an intervention unit for hostage situations. So if there was a hostage situation, our unit would be the first one to respond to it. Our job would be to contain it. If during the containment phase, before the designated hostage rescue unit would arrive on scene, or before they'd be prepared to execute a plan, if hostages were getting injured or executed, our job would be to go in and take over the situation. And so that was my service up until approximately 2010. I returned to North America. Canada is where I live predominantly. Got back into the service here. I served on a nuclear SWAT tactical unit. I did that for a couple of years. I then became I joined one of our transit authority services as a patrol constable. I did that for a couple of years. I had in 2014 an offer to come out to California to help in the development of a new tribal police department on this huge tribal reservation. And so I became the deputy commander of the tactical team and assisting to put all that together. That went on for about a year, and then they decided to disband their police service. They didn't need it anymore. So I came back to Canada, and in pursuit of wanting to maintain my status in the U.S., in 2018, I found a home with a sheriff's office in Georgia and became a reserve deputy. Which I am still to this date. I'm assigned to our Special Operations Division. The majority of my work is in training, and I'm back and forth, as required. We actually right now are putting together a county-wide joint hostage rescue team, which our office is going to lead, and we're going to have the different PDs in the county that are going to be part of that with their SWAT team. So I'm helping to spearhead that and help put all that together. And that takes us up to October 7th, where I've been out of the IDF for 13 years. And October 7th, like, many Israelis around the world, I dropped everything and re-enlisted in the reserves. So I've served so far for 4.5 months, and I'm in the reserves, signed up for another 3 years until the age of 50. My first tour of service in our reserves in this current situation, this current war, I spent 107 days assigned to a light infantry unit in the West Bank region, the Judea Samaria region, specifically in Hebron. Hebron is the largest out of the 5 main cities or towns that we have in the entire West Bank region. Hebron is the largest one geographically and the largest one by population. Has a population of about 219,000, out of which only approximately 1,000 are actual Jews and Israelis. So on a kind of mundane end of the spectrum of what we do, it's guard duty, monitoring and securing all the areas, the neighborhoods where the Jewish Israeli citizens live, and patrols. And on the more kind of specialized end of the spectrum, every night we would be carrying out raids and arrests of wanted terrorists, or, if our intelligence service would reach out and say, hey, we just locked on to an Arab in Hebron. He's going out to carry a terrorist attack. He's going to deploy tomorrow. He's going to deploy in an hour. Get over there and arrest him. That's kind of stuff that we would do. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic for me. After 107 days, our battalion was rotated out, and I came home. I was supposed to be home for about a month. And 10 days after I got home, another commando unit that I belong to, that I serve with, reached out to me and says, "We're going into Gaza in 2 days. Are you joining us?" I said, "Of course I am." So I was on a plane 48 hours later, and spent almost 3 weeks in Khan Yunis, Gaza, with my this unit I serve. Today I serve in two units. So this is one of them, Unit 906. And there, it was a very interesting dynamic. Our mission profile, our mandate with this particular unit is search and destroy. We would go in and target buildings where we knew Hamas or any one of its fellow terror organizations were operating out of, launching attacks out of. And our job would be to destroy those buildings and locate tunnels as well and destroy them. Or we'd be getting sent to enter and raid buildings where intelligence would indicate to us that at least at one point throughout the entire conflict, hostages were held in those buildings. And so obviously, the hope would be that we would find live hostages, but if not, then at the very least to find any sort of intel that would indicate where hostages were located. And it was a very unique experience, I'll call it, because Khan Yunis, so Gaza has kind of three sectors to it: the northern front, Gaza City, Sajaiya, and then the central area, with Khan Yunis being the main the capital of Gaza, and then Rafiq in the south. And when the IDF moved into to Gaza initially for the first invasion, end of October, a lot of all the central sector was being prepared for our arrival. So all the terror organizations there, predominantly again Hamas, were very well aware of the fact that from the north we would move into the center. So they started rigging up Khan Yunis with IEDs everywhere. And the three sectors, they're kind of known for their predominant threat types. In northern Gaza, the biggest modality of attack that our forces face there are RPGs and anti-tank missiles. And that is probably by virtue of the fact that they had a lot of their, Hamas would have a lot of its kind of heavy duty reinforcements there because we were invading with tanks and armored vehicles. It's always the armored brigades that lead everything. And so that was a predominant tool that they needed. And Khan Yunis, they knew that, the war would translate to us raiding buildings, looking for hostages and looking for members of Hamas and all the other terror factions. So Khan Yunis, the biggest threat type there are IEDs. And then in the south, Hamas is known for its sniping applications in all of southern Gaza. So it became a very unique kind of application because here we are having to employ almost, I would say, a conventional light infantry application of taking over buildings. However, we're contending with, simultaneous to that, potential hostage situations. So you can't always just blow buildings up before you go in, or throw grenades into the rooms, in order to pre-clear them. And then, of course, there's also the IED aspect to it, which the remedy or the best practice to try to mitigate an IED threat in a building before you go in is to blow it up and then go into the rubble afterwards. But again, we come back to the situation of what if we got hostages in there? So it became a very, very interesting dynamic of really having to think and be very scrutinizing of what tactics we are employing and how it is that we are proceeding. Now, we'll come back in more detail to this, but just to kind of sidestep for a sec, we have our tactics in the IDF that have always been very, very unique. And I'll caveat this again. I always make reference to American and Israeli tactics, and that's kind of how I pin my conversations. And let me just quickly clarify what I mean by that. It's not to pit one against the other. It's simply that the U.S. leads the way with tactics. Almost every allied special operations unit in the world does what the U.S. does. They have the same weapons, they have the same uniforms, they have the same beards, they do the same tactics. So that's kind of a big credit and point of respect for the U.S. In Israel, we've always done things very differently, and so when we talk about tactics to really contrast things, that is why I give that label of American and Israeli tactics. That's the only reason behind it. Second point I got a caveat here is that I've always experienced my whole life, if I'm talking to North Americans about Israeli tactics, their go-to right away is, well, he's an Israeli, of course he's going to say that. If I'm talking to, Israelis about certain things, well, he's an American, of course he's going to say that, right? So let me put an end to that right away. I'm an Israeli, a Canadian, and an American. I served in Israel, Canada, the United States. I was trained by Israel, Canada, the United States. I'm everything, all of them. I don't have a bias geographically or to what one particular country, does over the other. My only bias is to effectiveness and real life. I've always been concerned to make sure that I'm doing the right thing because I want to stay alive and safe. And if I'm teaching, I have a responsibility to ensure that what I'm teaching is truly best practices. And if you're serving and protecting, you have a responsibility to the people that you're serving and protecting. I would hate, to learn of a situation where a hostage rescue team went in to rescue hostages and hostages were killed because there was a better way of doing something as far as the tactic. So that's just my own personal, approach to everything. And so with that, going back to Gaza in this period right now, we in Israel, since the 80s, and I'll get into more details about that once we get into the whole, the CQB aspect. I hate the term CQB. I think it's a very misleading concept and term, right? And we'll discuss that momentarily. But up until the 80s, we had a lot of experience with conventional wars. We were invaded constantly by our neighboring countries, and we had a lot of experience being a small army in a small country against literally, 2, 3, up to 7 countries at once that would attack us. Going into the 80s, the early 80s, that is where our enemies decided to really get into the whole aspect of terrorism and surgical combat and to target Israel at its core. And that's where we saw a massive increase in hostage situations, in active shooting type of situations where they would come into Tel Aviv or into Jerusalem, jump out of a car, spray a crowd, throw grenades, and take off. And so that's where we had to actually learn methodologies, best practices to contend with all that. And in the early 80s, we adopted the American methodologies. And I'll put a pause on that right now. When we get to tactics, I'll dive more into that history aspect of it. But we adopted the American tactics, and what we had throughout the rest of the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s were the Israeli methodologies, the Israeli tactics that are really formed based out of the American tactics that were put through the true filter, which is what you and I both label as the standard. And I'll talk about that very quickly so people understand where the only thing that I care to hone in on and to discuss, which is everything based on the standard. You hear so many times guys in this profession, whether individuals or even teams, units, that'll sit there and say, we have done 1,000 entries, we've done 10,000 entries, and we've always been successful. That doesn't mean that what you're doing is effective. The question is, what challenges were your entries given? I can walk into a boxing gym and I can beat the hell out of a punching bag and I can look good doing it. Doesn't mean I know how to fight, right? What challenges were you given? The majority of entries that are done worldwide have always been, you breach the door, you go in, and you might have a threat in there, but the threat isn't shooting at you. The real standard is when you have a threat who is prepared for you, knows that you're about to enter, goes and grabs that AK-47, hides in a point in that space that you're about to enter, has a weapon pointed at the door, at your entry point. And when you expose yourself, you still have to perceive the threat, locate him, identify him, and respond. All he has to do is pull the trigger. The majority of the world has far more combat experience than we do in Israel, quantitatively. I'll give them that. We have far more experience than the rest of the world when it comes to combat experience against that standard. That has always been the norm. The kind of running joke that we've always had is that if we kick in a door to go and raid a building or whatever the case is, to go into a CQB environment, and that building doesn't blow up, or we don't take gunfire from the fridge or under the bed, something is wrong. That's been our standard. And that is the catalyst that shaped our indoctrination of the American tactics that came from Delta and converted them to the Israeli methodology, which quite frankly is, to keep it simple, the American term it's been given is limited penetration, which is really, we call it fighting from the doorway. When it becomes relevant in our discussion here, I'll dive more into what that actual absorption of the tactics were and how that transition took place. But just to get back on talking with Khan Yunis and tactical experience right now, going into about 2000, and so we had from 2000 2007 we had the second Intifada, the bloodiest era that we experienced in Israel. We averaged 8 to 12 suicide bombings per month, active terror attacks everywhere, right? So when you look at around the 2000 and would have been 2000, I believe 14 era, when Islamic terrorism started to attack systematically Europe, UK, Belgium, France, all the modalities of attack that you see happening, suicide bombings, vehicle ramming attacks, active stabbings, it all starts in Israel. We've been at this with our cousins for 3,200 years. All right, so this is how long we've been engaged in combat with them, and everything. They go to bed dreaming of different ways to attack us. The next day they go and they implement it. So all these modalities, we have been contending with them far longer than everybody else has. Excuse me. Now, it got to the point, I made a joke about, when we kick in a door, if the building doesn't blow up, something is wrong. It literally got to the point that we were sustaining a lot of casualties because of the amount of booby traps inside buildings, from IEDs to literally refrigerators shooting at you. And what do I mean by that? All these terrorists that attack us or are involved in planning attacks against us, they know that one day the IDF is going to kick in their front door and come and arrest them. So they prepare for it. That's how they live their lives. We would have situations where, by virtue of that preparation, they, for example, would live with an empty fridge. They would take out all the shelves. They would have, maybe a secondary fridge. That would be their living fridge. And their other fridge would be their preparation for the IDF fridge. So it would be positioned, right in front of the entry door to their apartment or house or whatever the complex is. And they would have 2 holes drilled into that door. One hole big enough for the eye, the other hole big enough for the muzzle of their AK to fit through. And as soon as they know that we're coming, because the neighborhood, just like drug neighborhoods, as you very well know from law enforcement in North America, they have their lookouts. All these terror groups have the same thing. So maybe their lookouts would quickly notify them, hey, IDF is en route. Looks like it's coming to this neighborhood. They're going to XYZ building. And then the terrorists will get the call that we're coming. And they would prepare themselves. They run up to that fridge, grab their AK, sit in it, close the door, and they would wait for us to breach the door, move in, and all of a sudden start to engage. It takes quite a bit of time to realize that a refrigerator is shooting at you. So it got to the point that we were facing too many unnecessary casualties because of all of these ambushes inside structures that we started finding alternative ways to clear buildings. We stopped sending teams into structures to search and to arrest. We would close on the outside. We would use megaphones to call them out. We would shoot at the window frames to try to put pressure to get them out. We would send dogs in. We would send robots in. We would, use all kinds of implements to try to clear the building. Ironically, our fighting from the doorway tactic, the whole concept is before we go into an unknown room, we'd like to have it all cleared from the outside. We would take that same concept and apply it on a macro level to structures, right? So there was a bit of a disconnect that started happening between our methodologies and why our methodologies were created in the first place, which again, I will come back to that as soon as it's relevant in our conversation here with where our methodology was born. Add to that the massive global influence. You're going now into, 2014, 2015, YouTube, all these big name instructors and operators and and respectfully, of course, I don't say this facetiously, but the rest of the world suddenly had 20 years of combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they got to have something to offer them, which I agree they do, but it doesn't mean on everything. Everybody's got their specialties, right? I know, having served in military special operations, in tactical units in North America, that I haven't used everything that I was trained in. It just doesn't happen that way. Somebody can be involved in a shooting. It doesn't mean that they were in a gunfight. You might be in a shooting with an M4. You weren't in a shooting with a handgun. There's a lot of nuances that come into play here. And what I think, you might agree with this, but I know what I've observed is you have a lot of guys that will go in respectfully. They'll serve somewhere. They'll do something. Navy SEALs, Delta, Israeli, this, say, I don't know, whatever it is. And they've done the thing. They're legitimate. And all of a sudden they're an expert on everything. It's not realistic, right? I can't be a boxer and go in and be a champion boxer and say that I know everything there is about MMA. It's two different games. There's different tools or different applications, right? So we start to get a lot of the influence of all this joint cooperation. And then a lot of guys all of a sudden would come up and be like, hey, man, why aren't we using a thumbs forward grip? It's a great grip. And so they would get to positions of influence, such as being instructors for their units. And then you'd start to see that grip happen, right? Hey, this dynamic entry, it makes sense. Theoretically, it makes sense. Why aren't we using it? Well, let's test it. Everybody will tell you that they've, what's it called? Everything that they do is battle tested and pressure tested. It's a load of bullshit. I'm sorry, but you cannot pressure test something in a controlled training environment. It's not a thing. I don't care about paintball and Sims. That's all fake make-believe. Okay. It gets to the point where you don't take being hit seriously, where they then try to compensate with, if you get shot, it doesn't matter. You keep going. You be mental Superman. You don't get to choose if you keep going. The bullet does. And that is something you have to have in reserve. That is something that if you get shot in the field, then you got to dig in deep and throw that mental Superman stuff in there. But the very first thing that happens is you got to hope that the bullet allows you to remain functional to do that. So the first question has to be, why did you get shot in the first place? Let's first look at that inside and out. That's number one. Number two, people don't like to challenge themselves. The majority of the ambiance in our profession, this alpha male, kind of mentality, is there's no way that we can be wrong with what it is that we're doing and teaching. Because if we're wrong, it makes us look bad, right? We can't undermine ourselves. So they don't challenge each other. There's a lot of this kind of incestuous, pardon the term, but circle jerking that goes on, a lot of. And, when you take somebody and you say, why is this tactic the right tactic? The common responses are always because that's the way we've always been doing it. It's always worked, right? That's the common response, right? Or we've done 1,000 entries with it and it's worked. That doesn't mean anything. The bad guy, the threats that we face don't need our strong side. Everybody has a crack in the armor, and that's all they need is that one crack. That is why when people in our profession get injured or killed, it's because of that crack, not because of how wonderful they are. So we started to disconnect with the realities. We didn't face the standard anymore. because we started to implement things where we would take the standard out inside a building before we had to face it with our muzzles and with our bodies, right? And ironically, fast forward now to this war. When I went into Gaza, I was with a commando unit that spent the first 3.5, I think, months it was in northern Gaza, and great unit. They're very smart. It's a unit that belongs to the IDF's squad leaders, commanders certification school. So they're the instruction branch of the squad leader course of the IDF. And we have 3 battalions. 2 of them are the battalions that are responsible for training the infantry squad leaders. And our battalion, Battalion 906, is the Special Forces battalion. So these are all thinking people. Very, very, very smart people. When I got there, I remember the briefings that we would get. The same day that I was brought in there on March 1st, I arrived to join my unit in Khan Yunis at our FOB in the evening. That morning, one of our sister battalions, we have 3 battalions under our brigade, the 906, which is us, the 450th and the 17th battalion. The 450th, the guys from the 450th, went in to clear a building, and it was booby-trapped with IEDs. And 3 of the guys were killed, and another 15 were injured. So I remember that evening, our commander was giving us the debrief on that. And then the next day, we had our first raid of a building. And we were being told, remember what happened to our guys yesterday. We're in Khan Yunis, which is laced with IEDs. You have to treat every building you go into as if there's an IED. And incidentally, in our battalion, my platoon is the suppressive fire platoon. We are the ones that lead the our entire battalion, and we're the first ones that go into every building. So we're the ones diving into all these situations first. So on a tactical level, the commanders are telling us, move slow, look out for IEDs, everything that you would expect to hear when that is the threat that you're facing. I remember going out on my first raid with the platoon. The platoon commander assigned me as his number 2 guy, and I came out of the counter-terror unit. I was, for lack of a better term right now, I'll use it, more advanced in terms of my qualifications and my training, especially in urban combat. So he had me lead everything. And I remember we went into the first building, and before I had a chance, right, the way that we would work back in my time when I was in the unit, we would never, unless there was hostages or civilians being killed, you don't rush in. There's no dynamic anything. We do everything from the doorway. Here I am on the very first doorway in Khan Yunis, and before I know it, my entire platoon is rushing past me and starting to kick in doors and going everywhere. I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Did I miss something? I missed the memo between move slow and methodical and watch out for IEDs and before we breach that first door. So this is how the dynamic entry, I'll revert to it again, call it the American concept, started to permeate the IDF in the last 10 years. And that's what they were doing. That's all they knew. That evening, I grabbed my platoon and I said, I'm taking charge right now. When we get to a building, as soon as we breach, and the breach would always be a hole from one of the rockets that we shoot into it. We'd never go through the main door. I said, I'm taking charge, and let me teach you guys about the original, what we call secure search methodology. Secure search is what we developed in the onset of Second Intifada, where when there's no civilians that we have to rescue, how we close on the structure and how we move in, and we move super slow. There's only a 4 operator element that goes in. Everybody else stays outside. We go from room to room to room. We never take multiple rooms at once. And everything is done very slow from the doorway before we go in. So I trained them up that night on the old methodology. All of them said, holy geez, can't believe how we've been doing things up to this point. And it all makes sense. The next day we went on our next raid, and I sent you a video clip of that raid from my GoPro, and that is where, after a couple hours of just training that methodology, we put in to practice in going forward our initial original secure search tactic protocol, and everything was a lot safer. So with that, I can also tell you, I remember just before I got to Israel, last week of October, I had an exchange with one of the guys from my original unit, my home unit, the counter-terror unit. And I knew by this time there was a lot of close quarters combat that was going on in southern Israel. That was the thrust of everything that was happening. We had guys that were killed. When I got the debriefs on some of our guys from my unit that were killed, it really pissed me off, because the likelihood is that their deaths would have been prevented if they stuck to our original methodology. I talked about, the standard being in the fridge, the threat being in the fridge waiting for you. We had threats that would hide under the bed, and they would start to, give bursts with their AK-47s from under the bed. Two of the guys that were killed in our unit in southern Israel on October 8th, they went into a house, and there was gunfire coming from one of the rooms. They hit they got up to the door, and two guys rushed in. They adapted the new method, the American method, a dynamic entry method. And as they rushed in, they both took fire from underneath the bed, didn't even see it coming, and both were killed. So I spoke with one of my guys from my unit, and I asked him, and I actually have a recording of this. This is on WhatsApp, and I kept everything. And I asked him, I said, listen, by now, 3 weeks into the combat, I know that there's been a lot of influence with the American tactics, the dynamic entry stuff that has permeated what we do in the IDF. How is that working? Are you guys doing that for all the combat? Or are you guys reverting back to our initial fighting from the doorway method? And I can play you the recording. He says, look, what's supposed to happen is dynamic entry. What never happens is dynamic entry, especially when you have, forget a threat in the room, when you have any indication. When the guys so much as suspect that there's an actual threat, nothing happens. They automatically revert back to the doorway. But the problem we have now is that there's been such a saturation of all the methods that they don't all know how to do it properly. So everything is coming back full circle now because of the unfortunate filter of the standard.
Yeah, there is a ton of stuff to get into. Honestly, not sure where to start. So one of the conversations, and this is tactics and related, that I guess I'm not even having conversations with people anymore because grown men don't know how to control themselves on Instagram. Okay. But, so, I've essentially, I don't think I'm ever going to turn on commenting on any of my stuff again, because it's a waste of time to try and react to these people and explain yourself in a comment section. And they just want to talk trash, they don't want to provide you, demonstrations or comparative, like this way to that way. They just want to say the things that you said they normally say, because of XYZ and all the times I've done it and it's worked. Right. There's a book that I'm going through now called Code Over Country. And I encourage people to go listen to that book. I'm listening to it because you could read it, Code Over Country. And it's essentially has everything to do with the Navy SEALs and, their behavior, so to speak. And of course, never to detract away from men who probably deserve more than they'll ever receive. Because of course there's a tremendous amount of just honorable men with a high level of integrity, but a lot of the times on some of these missions that they went on, and the story that was told afterwards doesn't line up with what actually happened. And one of those situations is I forget her first name, or maybe it's the doctor, I don't remember, but the rescue mission to rescue, her name was Norgrove. And what ended up happening in that situation is that, they flew in, they figured that they were probably in this compound or in this area. There was a lot of killing of bad guys that need to be killed, I assume. But, one of the SEALs threw a grenade, and that grenade killed her, right? Which is, it is one of their, obviously, right? You can't control what happens when you throw a grenade, right? There's no precision involved in that. And so she was killed by the grenade during a hostage rescue. And of course, there's kind of like a lie that goes into that to cover that up. But that was an unsuccessful attempt, right? And there are many other unsuccessful attempts where there was so many variables that you couldn't possibly account for, that resulted in the opposite of what we actually wanted to happen. And so, look, CQB is actually a very scary thing, and it's not a Hollywood highlight reel show of doing things. Maybe at times, right, you do things fast, but you're not going to go online and see, hey, this is how we set up a perimeter, and this is how we call people out, and this is how we arrest people that come out, right? Because that's not really popular, right? You can't really put music to that and get people interested in something like that. So there is kind of that aspect to it too, which I do understand and don't necessarily think that that's bad. But like you were saying, you mentioned, okay, we did this technique or this tactic in training with simunition. And I'll tell you this, I was never part of a scenario with simunitions where with a SWAT team where any member of the SWAT team ever went down, even though they were actually shot. Okay. And so in one of the videos that I pointed out, the riding the door into the room thing, it's not maybe necessarily a bad thing that we're going to go ahead and say, hey, let's work through this because we're here now. But we just completely ignore the fact of what actually just happened because we didn't actually see it happen, right? It was bang, 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 5 shots before anybody got in there to identify them. And this is a success. And so, maybe there is a different way to do it in those situations. So, CQB, we'll just say it's, you walk into a house, right? I mean, look, use your own house as an example. I'm certain that most people could take a step inside their front door and run through their own processes if they had 4 guys or 5 guys, how they would clear their own house. And I think you'll very quickly understand that it would be an actual disaster, okay? Because as an individual person, right, the whole kind of the goal of CQB is to identify and mitigate threats as you perceive them or approach them. And to be able to do that, you have to at least have your gun orientated towards that specific threat area. And as simultaneously as possible as you can do that, that's the preference, right? However, oftentimes you end up as an individual having to hold on 3 or 4 doors, right? Down a hallway, but I also have to look over here. And so while you can do that, that is, you cannot win a situation like that where you actually can't identify where the gunfire is coming from, right? And so one of the conversations that's kind of happening now, which I'm going to address in this idea of switching your rifle into your other shoulders to minimize your exposure, to be available to deliver around if you needed to, is I believe that there is an over-reliance, and I don't know if it's, hey, I've done this, I've done that, and I'm all these things, and so this is what's most important, forget everything else, but an over-reliance that marksmanship inside of a structure, when you don't see the guy coming, is going to be the thing that saves you. CQB is an unmanageable problem in the reality, but we oftentimes, like you said, end up going into the house, clearing the house, doing whatever, and it's a success because the bad guy wasn't actually sitting there waiting for you. And another thing that you said that is true, and something that I spend a lot of time reflecting on and focusing on is the human behavior aspect of it, right? So not only from the suspects, or I guess we'll just use suspects perspective, but also the operator or the officer's perspective, right? Not only is there a general guideline to like maybe what's best practice, but also, okay, well, if you're standing here, how more susceptible are you to being hit? And also, what are you going to do when the rounds start flying, right? And in some of the videos that I've kind of posted on the Instagram, the IDF's inside these buildings and they're moving forward to take these rooms, and then all of a sudden a barrage of gunfire comes out. And what happens is we pull back, right? Now maybe we're doing some other non-traditional things on the military side, like shooting through walls or, throwing grenades or all these things. But no person is trying to get in there. You know what I mean? Because it's psychologically and physiologically, it doesn't make sense in that moment if that person in there is only a danger to himself and nobody else. So I'll ask you this. You said that you were carrying out raids. I know you've done that. How successful were you in terms of operators or soldiers being injured when you were carrying out raids and doing this like a perimeter call out kind of mentality?
There's a lot of things that you brought up in that statement. So let me first very quickly answer your question. From the day in history where we developed secure search is what we call it, all right, which is starting from the outside and moving in slowly. One team goes in, 4 operators, and that's it. And we don't move an inch until that inch has been cleared. Our success rate rose drastically. It's hard to, I mean, look, it's easy to quantify the unsuccesses because you have the casualties to give you numbers, right? Very difficult to say how many lives were saved because there were no casualties to record, right? If that makes sense. However, I can tell you where, for example, you referenced a very specific incident that, if I remember correctly, was our Southern Command Givati Brigade in the clip where you see them going into the house, the building in Khan Yunis. And one of the guys actually mentions there's got to be somebody in here because there's a warm cup of coffee sitting on the counter. So that they knew somebody was there. And then that same soldier advances, he gets parallel to the wall, right? And only about a meter and a half in front of him is the doorway to the wall. And then that burst of rounds comes out the wall. And nobody, got injured, of course. They were lucky for that. I think it's fair to say that if they all came rushing in there, number one, they wouldn't have noticed indicators, such as the cup of coffee. And when you notice indicators, whether it's indication that somebody could very well be here right now, it changes your mentality of what you're going to do. If you have a tripwire, an IED, all right, just as a tripwire as an example, and you're rushing through there, you're not going to notice it. And then on a tactical level, they would have probably all rushed right through that threshold, gone in, and those rounds would not have been blindly sent through the wall. They would have been accurately sent at them. So I can tell you that when we started implementing our secure search methodology 30 years ago, 30 years ago approximately, there were less casualties in these high threat, close quarters environments. That's to answer that part of it. You talked about instincts. What happens when rounds start flying out that door? Nobody goes in. So let me go back right now to where our methodology was developed from. And by the way, incidentally, that incident of the terrorists firing through the wall, that rarely ever happens. Instincts is that people only shoot what they can see. So the majority of the times, the terrorist will wait. But again, there's no such thing as 100% in anything, and especially in CQB. I agree with you that CQB is the scariest thing that we have to do, probably the scariest thing that we have to do in this profession, because we're going into an unknown environment where you've got 360-degree value of angles, out of which any one of them can be a weapon pointed at you. And it's very difficult to be able to address that entire situation. And so I agree with you on that. Let me actually first very quickly talk about this term CQB and why I hate it so much. CQB is a tool. How you reach a door, how you move in a hallway, how you negotiate a corner, how you go upstairs or downstairs. These are tools. When I look at people take tools in order to create a methodology, I think it's very flawed. You're going to miss a lot of things, and you're going to misappropriate, and you're going to misapply many things. So what do I mean by that? When we're going into a structure, we're going into a building right now, okay, to apply CQB. If we have civilians and a threat, potentially, okay, we're going to be addressing it differently. Now, we might have civilians that are good guys, that are like hostages. We might have civilians that are unknowns. Doesn't mean they're good guys. We have a lot of this going on in Gaza. Okay. If we going in and we have a threat or a potential threat, but we have no indication or we know that there are no civilians or hostages, it'll be a different situation. Your mindset will be different, let alone how you should be doing things. Going into a structure when you have hostages and a threat in there is a whole different world than going into a structure when you have no hostages and there's just a bad guy hiding somewhere in there. And those two should not be treated the same way. Yes, there's overlaps in the tools that you're going to use. You're in a hallway. You're going to be going through thresholds. You're going to have stairs. So there's an overlap in the tools. But the mission profile, the objective, your resources, your mentality, what you're looking for. In one instance, you might have the availability to move very methodically and slow and, cover inch by inch. In another instance, you better cover meters in half a second or hostages are going to get killed. They're two different worlds. And this is where when I see people out there talk about, I'm running a CQB course, what the hell does that mean? To me, it tells me that you're not understanding the subject matter at length, or you've got somebody who, again, we talked about at the beginning, may have served in a special unit, may have been to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Gaza, but it doesn't mean that they have been really trained and knowledgeable in the whole topics of a certain subject. So when I look at this subject that we're talking about, CQB, I reference it by the actual situation, by the mission profile. And we have 5, okay, that I break it down to. First, we have a designated hostage rescue takeover. That means that you got bad guys, you got hostages, you have intel, you make a plan, and you go in based on that plan, based on your resources. If you know you've got, 50 rooms in this building, you've got at least 2 operators for every room right off the bat. And you've got your snipers and your dogs and your helicopters and whatever it is, okay? That's the first situation. Second situation is a hostage scenario, but an emergency intervention. So you have a team that is a responder team, but they are not a fully designated takeover team. They don't have 60, 80, 120 operators there with the snipers and the breachers and the what have you. They might only have 12 guys. And the circumstances are that the hostage takers are starting to execute the hostages, and you got to take this under-resourced element and have them go in and mitigate that situation. So, for example, I referenced this at the beginning, intervention units in Israel, the standard for that is you got to have 12 operators. We have 2 vans, 12 operators, all the teams are there. We get notification of an incident, we jump into vans, we hit the scene. The first thing that happens, if we know it's a hostage situation, not active yet, 12 guys right away find the nearest entry point and they set up on that entry point. And the moment that they hear gunshots or screams, they're going in, okay? It's not a hostage rescue team. They don't have the resources for that, okay? That's the second situation. The third situation is an active killing incident. In North America, we refer to it as an active shooting incident, but that's just because we become sensitized to the fact that it's always, well, it's not a fact, it's not always, the majority of all these incidents, guns are used. So you have the indicators of gunshots, right? And that's what you're contending with. But it could be an active stabbing attack, which, we see everywhere in the world. There's other modalities of killing. So there, you might have 1 officer, you might have 3, 4 operators, okay? It's a whole different world. We then have the last 2, which are the same kind of mission profile, but 2 different applications, modalities. And this is where we have a CQB environment, a structure. We have us, the good guys. In that structure, we have bad guys. We're a bad guy. We have no known civilians. We have no hostages, nobody that we know we have to save, okay? Maybe we have civilians in there. Again, we don't know whether those civilians are part of the bad guy's plan, and they're going to shoot us in the back, if we ignore them or treat them as good people. But we have two applications, two modalities. The first one, this is what secure search is. It's where we breach open that door. There's no secret to the fact that we're there. We're loud. We're talking with one another. We're sitting there on the threshold on the door saying, okay, we have a hallway. I've got an open door to the left. I have an open door on the right, a couple meters up. Here's what we're going to do. Here's where we're going to go. The bad guy knows that we're there, and it's okay. There's no issues with that, okay? The second modality is if it's a situation where we have us and we have bad guys inside this complex, but we're going in stealth. We don't want the bad guys to know that we're there. That's a whole different world. Unless I'm missing one, those are the 5 mission profiles that we have that take us into a CQB environment. None of those are the same. None of them are the same, despite the fact that there is some interchangeability with some tactics, and things like that. You can't treat them the same. So there's no such thing as putting on a CQB course and having your students walk out properly prepared to address the specific mission profile. So that's already where it makes me cringe when I hear this term CQB, because it already shows the disorganization and misunderstanding, which equates to mispreparation, whether it's yourself or your team that you're preparing or students that you're teaching. So now, with that in mind, let's go to the instincts you referenced instinctive response on both sides, bad guys and good guys, which is crucial to understand. Let me first talk about the bad guys. I see a lot of these, pressure tests theories out there. We have pressure tested this technique. We have pressure tested that. We've done it 1,000 times. You have not. You have mimicked as much as you can, but unfortunately, what you have done lacks the actual DNA that brings a situation to life. And what I mean by that, I don't care that you have a role player sitting in a room waiting for you to enter with Sims. Your role player is not an actual threat who's there to kill you. They don't share the same emotions. They don't share all the same finite micro elements that go into the head and into the making of the real threats that we face out there. So it's not the same. All right. I remember, I will refrain from dropping names here just out of respect for, everybody involved. But there is a agency or an entity in the United States that is kind of the spearhead entity that relates to active shooter training. And they have these great videos online, instructional stuff. And one of them has to do with, the CQB thing, this response of officers into an active shooter environment. And they talk about statistics about how when they ran on all of their simulations of what goes on in an actual active shooter incident, when you have a bad guy in a room, that's supposed to translate to here's the best practices of how we, the tactics that we do because of the statistics of what we have discovered in research. And they show their research, and they have a role player in a room who's hovering around the center of that room, walking around with a semi-mission gun. And they said that, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, the majority of the times, the threat was in the center of the room. That is utterly false. It is utterly false. And I will tell you by virtue of observation and experience, and by the hundreds of thousands of professionals that I have trained over the course of my 25 plus years in this profession, that the majority of threats do not sit there and hang out in the center of a room in any of the 5 situations that I talked about. When they know that you are there, or even when they don't, if they have an inkling that you might be there, many times they try to seek safety as well. And they will be in a corner. They will be hiding among a group of hostages. They will be hiding in a closet. They will be under a bed. So right away, we have this fundamental flaw with all this pressure testing nonsense. Pressure testing only happens in one arena. That is in the systematic experiences time after time after time of real life. That's the data you have to go off of. So we have the instincts of the threats. Let's talk about the instincts of the operators and where the Israeli methodology came to be. Going into the early 80s, as I talked about earlier, we started to deal with a lot more hostage situations, a lot more closed environment, CQB environment scenarios against threats. We had a tremendous amount of experience in conventional war, but our battlefield was changing now, and we needed more surgical warfare knowledge and methodologies. Unit 767, Sayeret Matkal, our Delta unit, Delta/SAS unit, went to the US Delta unit and said, look, you guys have a tremendous amount of experience. What do you guys do when it comes to CQB? How do you take over rooms? So back then, the methodology, which you have US Delta and you have the British SAS, and those were really the leaders of developing special operations and crack units and CQB and all this kind of stuff. And I believe they were both doing the similar application, where you have a room, you take a minimum of 4 operators, they go in, 1 and 2 would right away dig the close corners, and their job would be to right away get to the far corners. 3 and 4 follow right in behind, take the close corners. And now you have an operator in each corner, weapons facing in. You have dominated the room from a 360-degree environment. That makes complete sense. And that is what these officers from our unit 767 took away. They said, excellent, we know exactly what we're going to do now because that makes complete sense. Excuse me. So they brought that back. And that is the tactic for taking over a room that was implemented. How many times did it work? I'm asking you.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, it worked 100% of the times when there was no standard in the room, when there was no challenge in the room. Easy stuff, like beating up a punching bag. You're always going to look like the greatest champion boxer. Whenever there was a challenge in that room, whenever the operators started the process of trying to transition from the hallway into the room and gunfire hit, it worked 0% of the time. So they started going back to the thinking board, right? The drawing board, whatever it's called. The thinking table, the drawing board. All right, we're not having success here, so how do we change it? What is the problem? The problem is it doesn't make sense to take 4 corners when you have gunfire coming in from inside the room. It doesn't work. So we're Israelis. We know how to think. They said, all right, let's try to kind of short circuit or minimize the amount of work that we have to do. Let's challenge time. Let's try to be more efficient here. Instead of taking the 4 corners, let's have 1 and 2 get into that room quickly and take the close corners. 3 and 4 just follow in and make a line. Genius. Absolute genius. Doesn't make sense to think about the depth of the room when you've got a bad guy with a gun in there preventing you from being able to move in. So that became the next evolution. And how many times did that work?
100% of the time with no standard, probably.
See, you're catching on.
Yep.
Exactly. 0% of the time when the standard was in the room, when there was a challenge. They said, okay, we're obviously missing something here. What is it that we're not looking at? And the realization came to be that forget corners inside a room. You cannot even start to think about or talk about inside the room if you can effectively transition through that threshold. And when you have a bad guy in that room sending bullets towards or into that threshold, nobody is taking a step forward. I sent you that clip that I use in training, that SWAT team in Burbank, California, right? At the bank, and they all approach, and all of a sudden gunfire comes out, and everybody runs back. That's what happens. You will always be a human before you are any type of an operator. And that's where the problem lies, is that the scary part about room clearing is we don't know what we're walking into. We have to first transition through that threshold. We have to then contend with our laws of reaction. In the US, it's called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, determine, act. Here in Canada, it's perceive, analyze, formulate, execute. And as a human, you are bound by that law. Everything we do is a reaction. Everything in life that we do is a reaction. The point is that we're not facing stress with the majority of the reactions that we have to give, and we have enough time to complete the reactionary process. When you are jumping into an environment that you don't know what is going on, right? And we also know this to be true, that 99% of every training environment does not even look like real life. You don't have these 4 bright white walls and a playing field, a floor, that, let's just humor the fact that this is supposed to be real training. Put a desk here, put a bed there. It doesn't look that way. You've got low lights, no lights, plants, toys, bags. You've got a mess. You've got smells. You've got all kinds of things, right? So you now are jumping into that environment, the unknown environment. And again, you now have to perceive, analyze, formulate, execute. The bad guy has already done all that. He knows you're there. All he has to do now is act. So when you cannot effectively know where the threat is, your inclination is going to be to not advance towards it. When these rounds are actually hitting, whether it's the frame of the threshold, coming through the wall, transitioning over your shoulder into that, the space that is the doorway, the threshold. And by the way, one of the biggest fantasy theories that exists in our profession is this notion of the fatal funnel. It's a load of bullshit. That term sets everybody up for disasters. Threats are not shooting at a fatal funnel. They're not shooting at the threshold. They're shooting at you. And if you are stuck outside, that's where they're shooting to. If you come running inside and you get to the corner, they're going to be following you with their weapon. Okay? There's no such thing as a fatal funnel. What there is either you or the bad guy being in the concept of the fatal funnel. That depends on who is taking control. I have been in and I've seen more than enough good guys being on the threshold and actually dominating and keeping the bad guy's head and weapon incapable of engaging, then the reverse. It depends on mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say this, I've pointed that out several times in several of the videos I've done using the threshold. And I understand that, well, most people just don't know what they're looking at, I guess. But a common default to that idea is, well, that's just drywall. Okay, that's the first thing. And to kind of like combat that statement that actually offers nobody any value or any information is oftentimes, first of all, it is not only just drywall. Okay, if you go open up my bedroom to my master bedroom, there's a dresser right inside the door, right, just to the right. Okay, could that dresser and the things inside and the things within the wall cause the round to do something else before it gets to me? Yes, absolutely, that could happen. If you go inside of a hotel room and you open the door and you look outside of that hotel room, those walls are going to be pretty long. And for somebody to have to, engage you, they would have to basically stand in front of the door, which is probably not likely. Okay. So all that round has so many opportunities to do something else before it gets to you. And then the other thing that I say to kind of like ask this question, okay, if that's just drywall, what is the better alternative? Because what their better alternative is in that situation, instead of using that as for what you have in that moment to dominate from that position there, is to get into the room. Basically, it's like, okay, well, you're taking away something that I have in that moment to use and giving me nothing, right? And then people go, well, it's just concealment. I get it. It may be. However, from the beginning, almost from the beginning of warfare itself, concealment has been taught, not only just to the military, but law enforcement people as well, because concealment offers you something. And what it offers you is potentially the opportunity to not be seen, therefore maybe not be hit. Okay, if I'm in a field and we're rushing a bunker, or we have to traverse this field to get to this house where we're taking gunfire from, and I'm running and there's a giant bush in front of me, I'm going to get down behind the bush if I have to get down versus having to get down in the open. I know that the bush is not going to protect me from gunfire, but I hope that he will not be able to see me to have the opportunity to engage me.
It's beautiful, 100%. And it's something that I've always thrown in as part of the training when I teach, room entries and everything, that first fundamental. Concealment gives you something, nothing gives you nothing, right? If we just forget the CQB environment, and this is kind of the example that I give, right? So I'll take students, usually police officers, and I tell you, your firearm is in your holster, and you have a threat in front of you whose weapon is already out, and they're about to shoot at you. That's where the gunfight is going to begin. Okay, we talk about gunfighting and training for gunfighting. I'm really not interested in the situation where our guns are out first and the bad guy's gun isn't out, or we both have our guns out at one another. Those are different scenarios than when you're sitting there still trying to identify who this person is and they suddenly pull a gun, start to shoot at you, and you now have to start by drawing your weapon. Okay? Changes everything. So if we are in that situation, the worst case scenario, and you're about to get shot at, all right, and that is where the gunfight is going to begin, and I give you the option of either having nothing or having cover. Which would you choose? Everybody chooses cover. That's common sense. You want to have hopefully the time of being unaffected by the bad guy's gunfire to get your weapon out and get into the game, right? If the options are you can have cover or concealment, which one would you choose? Generally, everybody chooses cover, which I would choose as well. Makes sense. I'd rather have something that will stop the bullet to give me the time to get in the fight. If you have the option of having nothing or concealment, which would you choose? And it's funny, forget CQB. In this environment where all I'm saying is you got a bad guy in front of you, you already know what's going on. There's nothing hidden here. He's got a gun pointed at you. He's about to pull the trigger, and you got to draw your weapon in response. Do you want nothing or do you want concealment? Everybody chooses concealment. Makes sense. Why? Because that gives you something over nothing. It may, like you said, we know that rounds going through something might be affected, might deflect. We know that him not being able to see us might cause a miscalculation as to where he thinks we are, and he might miss. There's the instinctive value of the fact that bad guys tend to want to first shoot when they see you. Maybe that will put a pause on him mentally. Like, there's too many things on the list of things that it might give you over nothing. In a world of CQB, we fight to get as close to 100% as we can. There is no 100%. We fight to do everything, to throw every pebble on our side of the scale to give us chances at surviving. Sometimes it doesn't matter what we did and how right we were. It wasn't our day and luck wasn't on our side, right? But still, that is the whole point of it.
This is what I commonly say, right? And this is the way law enforcement does things. And maybe there's confusion, okay? But 95% of law enforcement's interaction inside of residences is usually searching for a person that may or may not be there, right? And when they are doing that thing, they are not moving quickly while they're doing it, because it's inherently known that the best thing that we could possibly do in this unknown layout here is gain a foothold and look at the next problem and develop a plan to attack that specific problem. Okay. Why is that preferred? Well, it's preferred because we've never been in here before. We haven't seen all of these things. And yes, we could default to our training and experience and the fundamentals of CQB, which you may have to do in a very particular situations like hostage rescue, but that's not what the mission is here. And I believe that whatever we're calling it, CQB, or searching for people inside of structures, when that isn't the case, is way more of a thinking man's psychological game than it is your ability to apply whatever fundamental skills that you do have that you also do need. And so you talked about in the one case where they were going inside because they were kind of going slow, they were able to identify that there may be a person in this room based on what they were seeing, and therefore they were able to take a little bit extra precaution and probably afford the opportunity to not be killed in that situation. And there's a video that I posted recently where, so cut the story kind of short, the officer was shot on a traffic stop. It hit him in the shoulder. The suspect drove down the street, crashed, and basically went into a couple different houses with a weapon. Big response from law enforcement. I think multiple SWAT teams showed up, and the officers were investigating, this house. That I don't know if they had a witness that said they went in there, or their posture assumed to me that they were assuming like he could be in here, but there's no real evidence to indicate that. That's the way they kind of approached it, in my opinion, because they knocked on the door, had the glass door open. The female inside opens up the main door, and when she does that, for whatever reason, she's basically like, she gets on the ground right there. Victim, homeowner. And right when she does that, the bad guy starts shooting at the threshold from inside. And so what happens is, one of the officers recognizes, hey, we need to get her out of here. He jumps up into the threshold and is just shooting at something, right? Which is neither here nor there. And he pulls her out and gets her out of there. He gets shot in his vest in the process. And what ends up happening from that point forward is I think the officer at the threshold also begins shooting back at one point. And then the guy who is covering the big window next to the door asks they have not a conversation, but they ask one another, where is he? And the guy covering the window says, I don't know. And then he starts shooting like 30 rounds into this residential, house where, you have no idea who's in there. Obviously we know the bad guy's in there, but we don't actually know where he is. And then, but to get to the main part of that story, the guy bails out of that house, the backside. They follow him with a drone, and he essentially ends up in this shed, which I think from the drone you would know that he's in there, but let's just say they didn't know, and so they saw this shed and they were like, hey, let's check this, right? And so again, speed, surprise, and violence of action, right? Like, we need to get in here and we need to clear this structure. So they go inside the shed, and immediately when they go in, it's just filled with stuff everywhere. There's just, the ground is littered with stuff to the left and to the right. There's just piles of things, boxes, etc. And as basically the one SWAT guy or operator is moving down the aisle to, kind of just sweep what he sees, there's about 2 steps before he actually gets shot at by the guy. They notice blood on the fridge, right? And they say, hey, there's blood on the fridge. And so as he takes about another step and a half, he turns to the left. And of course, what's waiting for him? The standard, a bad guy with a gun like this, right? And he shoots at the guy, the SWAT guy, and luckily the round hit his flashlight on his muzzle, and therefore he was able to engage him. His buddy next to him was able to step up and engage him, and then they pulled out of there, right? And so, that's a testament to just saying that it's really truly an unmanageable situation, and you are reacting and having to identify, and where is he? I see him. What is that? By the time he's already shooting. And so if we could have identified, and they were moving slow, but if we could have identified that there was blood on the fridge and we thought maybe he could be in there, at that point, hey, let's back out. And then they set up a perimeter on that, and they at a minimum send a dog in, right? But they probably have drones, they probably have all these things. But again, what happened when the gunfire started? They engaged, and then they pulled out of there, right? They didn't continue to press on where he was and say, hey, we got him, that's it, it's over. They pulled out of there, and I don't know what happened afterwards. I assume all the things that they could have possibly done if they had identified that situation, they could have done those things first instead of what they probably did afterwards, which was, probably send in technology or whatever. And somebody had messaged me about that video and said, why would you give up ground once you gain it, right? And that's another mentality thing that I actually was talking with a former, I guess, special forces guy the other day, and he said, that's not really a thing. That's ridiculous. We gave up ground all the time to better our position. But this is kind of the mentality of the way people think, or what's been ingrained in people, right? Is, we own that space. And it's like, but hang on a second. This guy is now at this point buried under things that you can't see. He essentially, he was shot, and now he's covered in boxes and whatever. So visibly seeing him, standing over top of him, you couldn't see him, right? And so does it even make sense to walk up to him to assess whether he is okay or not? Or is shot? No, because why? Because if he's holding a gun like this underneath a box and I can't see him, it's game over.
Yes.
And so that's just another example of how we could have identified, because let's say the officer's killed right there, right? I guarantee you, I know what that conversation sounds like. Okay, they're walking through there, they see the blood. Hey, I think he's in here. There's blood on this fridge, and then the officer's killed. They would sit down if they were, wanted to identify what could have been done better, which I assume people of that caliber do that kind of thing. And they would have said, once we identified that we thought he was in there, we should have pulled out. We have all these other assets. We have a canine, we have a drone, we have these things. We didn't need to push in there, right? And so, what I used to say to my team is like, we have to really, before we go out and we have this operational plan or whatever, we have to try and think about all these things that could happen and cross all these things off, so that when we get in the after action, Or if something bad does happen, we can say, man, we thought of everything. We thought we had it buttoned up and it just wasn't our day. There was nothing that we could have done about that, versus having to have that conversation with so-and-so's wife or so-and-so's family and say, we messed up, or we could have made a better decision and we just didn't.
Yeah, wow. I don't know that I'm familiar with that incident. I don't think I've seen that video yet, but quite a bit of very valid things that you brought up there. Let's go for a second back to kind of the micro aspects here of what we're talking about. You mentioned how the mission profile of police officers, they go in to search an environment where maybe there'll be somebody, a wanted person, for example, or not, right? And they tend to move slow, okay, which I agree with. And here's the thing, though, is there's moving, for example, from room to room, or in a hallway, or in an open space, say from the kitchen to the living room. But then there's the transition from whatever that space is into a room, the threshold. And I think that's kind of where all the magic has to be. So we see also a lot of, even in methodologies where they are moving slow in the environment, they get to the threshold and it's a dynamic flush, dynamic entry, right? It kind of, I think, contradicts the whole moving slow aspect of it. If you're moving in a hallway and you're moving slow, you're moving from point to point, you're moving slow, why all of a sudden are you going from a known to an unknown quickly? You're kind of resetting and falling right back into all of the negative things that you have now put on yourself. Delayed reaction and processing time, identification time, and what have you. So I'll go back for a second again to the catalyst that kind of created our methodologies in Israel. They realized that when rounds are flying at that threshold or through that threshold, nobody's moving forward. Instinctively, if they've already started the process of crossing that threshold and there's rounds happening where their ability to process, to identify, to react is dominated by the stress of the situation, they suck back right away. Why do they suck back? They suck back to their most perceived level of safety, which is that thing between them and that threat. If anything, you're taking away the threat's visibility as well. So you're complicating things for the threat as well. And that is where the decision was made, okay, if we are contending with this instinctive response that you will never be able to fight, you will never dominate instincts. There are some times where what you perceive to be instincts can be kind of tactically sharpened and changed. But when you are under an overwhelming amount of stress that dominates you, you're not going to fight through that. So the methodology right away became to the instincts, which is stay on the opening, move slow, start to open the room from the outside. What you're also doing now is you are inviting the threat to expose themselves, which quite frankly, if I'm walking up to a room, excuse me, to a threshold, I would really love to know before I even go in and expose myself to a threat that there is a threat inside there. And I would love for anything to be done to force them to expose themselves. So let me talk about very quickly some of the bonus things that automatically get addressed optimally with our method of from the doorway, fighting from the doorway, clearing from the doorway, searching from the doorway. We got to the point where we would also have our muzzles extend past the threshold. And the reason why that happened is because, right, so if we, for example, we're standing on a firing line, let's just call it 25 yards, okay, 15 yards, okay, we have a target. And I ask you to give me a grouping like this. Let's just say about a head size, face size grouping on that target at 15 yards. Could you do it?
Yeah.
And anybody can. If I can do it, anybody can. All right? As long as you have mastered your 7 principles of shooting, All right, your stance, your grip, your sight alignment, sight picture, your trigger squeeze, your breathing, your follow through. You're putting that round where you need it to go. Okay, easy stuff. Now, take this grouping in that controlled environment where you can apply all the principles of shooting, and put that into a real life gunfight or shooting scenario. What tends to happen to this grouping? It tends to drop 2 to 3 feet. It tends to spread 2 to 3 feet. Okay. Now, why does it drop? First of all, it drops because nobody stands up here tall and big and exposed when all of a sudden something scares us and is flying at us. We crouch down. So that is where, when you used to see policing dominated by, for example, the Weaver stance, before things transitioned to the more predominantly to the isosceles stance, you would see everybody on the range being nice and tall. And when you see all the cruiser dash cam footage of police officers in gunfights, nobody stands angled. Everybody bases out. They're more in an isosceles type of a stance, and they're all low. You crouch down. You bend down. That's one of the instincts of keeping you safe from an unknown threat. Make yourself a smaller potential target. Throw into the mix now the tool, the handgun. We know very well that you got to have structural integrity in your arm to control that gun, right? What do you see cops when you look at all the dash cam stuff, even till today? When a police officer is under fire all of a sudden, right? Most, as you know, almost all police interaction starts within that 3-4 foot range because it starts in this contact investigative range. And when the bad guy decides, oh shit, this is a bad situation for me, and they decide to now draw their gun and shoot, that's where distance opens. So what do you see all cops do? They all rush backwards. They fly backwards, right? As their gun is out and as they're shooting. And why do they do this? Okay. We can fool ourselves and say, well, it's to gain tactical advantage here, open up the distance, get behind cover. That's bullshit. It's not why. It's because they're fucking petrified. Because bullets are flying at you. You want to get the hell away from what's about to kill you. And that's true for all of us. And so as their body is moving backwards, they're still trying to punch this gun out here. And that tends to cause the wrist to also break down. Add that to them crouching, your line of fire now, the grouping tends to drop. Why does it spread 2 to 3 feet? Well, we understand that if we took all the principles of shooting, those 7 principles of shooting, stance, grip, sight alignment, sight picture, trigger squeeze, breathing, follow through, if we had to take the most important, it would probably be the sight work and the trigger squeeze. If we want that bullet to really go where we want it to go, right? And we know very well that in a real life gunfight, okay, not a shooting, not when the officer has their gun out, they already know what the situation is, they're mentally cued in, and a gunfight, and especially a reactive gunfight, where the officer has to draw their weapon and engage when rounds are already flying at him or her. There's no controlled trigger squeeze. They're smashing on this trigger. For every 1 round the bad guy sends at you, they're trying to send 10 rounds back. And so this smashing on the trigger finger does what to the muzzle, right? Makes it bounce around. So what have we unfortunately experienced over the years in Israel? When our operators coming up to a threshold and they start the process of clearing, when there's a distance between the muzzle and the wall or the threshold, and rounds start flying at them, their instinct is to obviously return fire. And many times you don't have this micro surgical capability, all right, of seeing the laser of your muzzle, making sure it's right past that threshold. And too many instances where the muzzle was actually on the threshold and rounds would hit, there would be splashback. In some cases, operators would be severely injured. In other cases, they'd be killed. This also has happened a lot to allied nation soldiers in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Over the years, it's what happens. The kind of joke I like to give, you can go on to every single training range out there, and there's one thing that you will see, no matter where in the world you are. Take any piece of barricade, and it will have bullet holes on it. And those bullet holes are not from paper targets shooting at the officers in training. Those bullet holes on the barricade are from officers shooting the barricade in a controlled environment. There's no stress. You have the ability to close an eye, close both eyes, open 3 eyes, line up your sights, do whatever the hell you want. And still under those circumstances, rounds are hitting the barricade. So by protocol, we have made it that our muzzle goes past the threshold. So let's talk about, the kind of internet. I like how you label it with all the nonsense that goes on online. Let's talk about all the things that, that we hear out there. You're letting the bad guy know that you're there. Your weapon's going to get grabbed. Who cares? And who cares? So first of all, letting the bad guy know that I'm there. If this is a situation, remember the 5 mission profiles I talked about, which would be in a CQB environment. The last one I talked about was where it's you, there's bad guys or a bad guy that you're going after, and it's a stealth operation. In that circumstance, the bad guy shouldn't know that you're there. The way you enter, the way that you breach, right? The way you're moving on, you'll be probably in darkness, you'll have your nods on, and that's where you want to move very quietly and be undetected. And that is where I will say that it is probably more prudent to not have the muzzle pass the threshold. In every single other predicament, we want the muzzle past the threshold. I want to ensure that every round goes to the threat, doesn't get interrupted. Okay. Now, the second aspect, I remember even when I was going through my tactical qualification training here in Canada. It's the same example that I have heard so many times, even on YouTube online, about why it's a big no-no to not have your muzzle pass the threshold, because somebody might grab your gun. First of all, I don't know to this date, I've researched, of a single incident where a police officer or an operator has had their weapon grabbed because it was over penetrating. Do you know of any such instances by chance?
I don't know of any, but I know that there's claims of a lot of that happening without verification.
That's a good way to put it. I know a lot of claims too, and I'll put my claims up against every barricaded on every training range that has bullets in it, shot by the officers or the operators on that range. That's number one. I don't know of any instances, and if there are, it's kind of like in that IDF video of the rounds being shot through the wall. It is very rare, and I don't believe in creating a whole methodology over something that rarely exists. Now, with that said, there's a one YouTube video that I've seen. It's a U.S. Navy SEAL guy. He's fairly well known, and I've seen interviews with him. He's a badass individual. Has a hell of a lot more experience than I do, and he has a video of him talking about room entries, and he talks about the danger and the no-no of this over penetration and keeping a distance. Okay, they like to have a distance from their muzzle to the threshold as much as possible. And he actually gives this example that if your muzzle is sticking past the threshold, can you imagine if a big bad guy in there grabs it, pulls you in? Like, how scary would that be? That scares you? Yeah, you're doing everything that you're doing. You're going into these scary places in the world, with a small team, going into all these compounds, going against IEDs, and that's what scares you? What, did you, out of all your years of training, did you skip weapon retention training? Who gives a shit? So somebody grabs your gun. That's part and parcel of everything. You know how many cops have their guns grabbed on traffic stops? That's a norm. That has to become part of your repertoire of being able to contend with it. And quite frankly, I would rather have somebody grab my gun than shoot at me. Number one. Number two, if my muzzle is past that threshold in one of the most dangerous environments that we know of, which is this CQB environment, and somebody on the other side grabs my gun, I owe them a thank you. Thank you for letting me know that you're there and where you are. I can easily contend with somebody grabbing my muzzle. There's too many things that can easily be done. So, we are up on that threshold. Our muzzle is past. If not only do we want to clear and fight from the outside, if I can already trigger a reaction from inside the room to allow me to fill in this equation of understanding that somebody is there, where they are, what implements they have from the outside, from safety, I would rather do that. Can I be up on that threshold and my muzzle sneaks past the threshold and he sees me and he decides to plaster the wall with rounds? Yes, that's a possibility. That could also happen with me simply walking up to that threshold, there's too many what ifs that are just not relevant. You are not going to address the 100% or 100% of everything that can go wrong. So, and when we take that now and we start to expand into all the other tactics, all the other mission profiles, hostage rescue, intervention, automatically by being up on the threshold from the outside. Okay, so from the outside, I'm already clearing the whole room. If I'm by myself, okay, the fashion statement of single operator work has become very big in the last handful of years. Okay, it's a methodology, it's a concept, forget methodology. It's a concept that we invented in Israel. We've been doing it since the 80s. And the reason why we've been doing it is not because one day we sat there and said, you know what, we should create this single operator course. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with the fact the standard that we have always faced is terrorists who know they are under everything. They're under-resourced, under-skilled, under capabilities, yet they want to have an impact. They want to be able to sneak into Israel, kill as many people as they can before they will be killed. And so that's the essence of terrorism, by the way. That's the essence. When you take the definition of terrorism and you convert that into a kinetic application, that's what it is. It's an ill-intended individual who wants to kill innocent people that comes into your homeland, a cafe, a restaurant, a school, a shopping mall, whatever the case is, uncloaks and starts to kill everybody and keeps on killing until somebody puts a bullet in their head. And so we have learned that no matter which way you cut it, if you want to save lives, as many lives as possible, whoever is there on scene or the first person to arrive on scene, you have two legs and you have a gun, you have a responsibility to engage. There's none of this bullshit of standing around waiting for backup, all the nonsense that drives active shooter intervention training in North America. That's where I'm the most passionate about, is that subject there. And it's a subject that has so much theoretical greatness to pull the cloak over people's eyes, yet in practice, it's the biggest load of nonsense. That has become the law in Israel. You're a security guard, you're a police officer, you're a soldier, you're walking down the streets of Tel Aviv, and all of a sudden, there's an attack going on, you have a gun, you get over there, and you engage the threat. That's where we develop the concept of single operator combat, and that is what everything that we do is based off of, first and foremost. So now, for me, I watch, for example, a lot of these attempts at teaching single operator stuff. And, when they're in the hallway, they have a lot of great concepts about all the different angles and points of exposure you got to watch out for. And then they get to the threshold. And what do? They come rushing in, take a corner, then right away pivot over to the other corner. What have you done there? You have given yourself not even a 50-50 chance, not a 50-50 chance, okay? Why 50-50? We have two sides. And as humans that have, we're not birds with eyes on the side of our heads, they're in front, we can only see one side at a time. You got to pick left or right. Now, if the bad guy is on the right and I decided to come into the right, I still don't have a 50-50 chance, because is it the standard? And when I come in, will I be able to see him, let alone engage him before he pulls the trigger? So you have less than a 50-50 chance. Now, if he happens to be on the left side of the room, tucked away in the corner or whatever the case is, and I come rushing into the right side, what in God's good name do I really think I'm going to accomplish? I'm taking rounds to the back, unless he decides not to shoot me, which is most likely a decision that he would have already made long before I came into that building. So by me being outside that threshold, I can start to dissect this room even by myself. All right. Right until I get to that last 10 to 15 degrees that we know of, which is the corners. And then I sent you a video of one of the variations of the methodologies that I developed for how a single operator can take both of those corners, which will bring a single operator as close as possible to being able to mitigate what a bad guy might do if I misidentify, and allow me a proper equilibrium, a proper balance of being able to respond left or right just as quickly. It's hard to get into, the actual discussion of actual tactics in this format, right? Maybe we'll do a follow-up to this where we will be in, with weapons in an actual environment. I can demonstrate while I'm talking. But with that, we then started to develop the different mission profiles: secure search, hostage rescue, intervention, active attack intervention. The concept of fighting or mitigating the situation from the threshold applies to all of them, with variations dependent on the nuances that exist there. So, for example, if we take a hostage rescue situation, we have a method in which we take 3 operators. All 3 of them can get into that room practically simultaneously. Okay, backtrack for a sec. The dynamic entry method, the stack and flow, whether you're crisscrossing, button hooking, whatever the case is, there exists 0 definition of it being simultaneous. It is always a one after the other. Now, in some cases, you got teams out there, operators that do it so flawlessly that you're very close. I mean, they're almost back to back, but I don't care. You're not simultaneous. We have a method that makes it as close to simultaneous as possible, with the caveat that we know that we're going into a room that there's threats there, and we know no matter which way we enter, American, Israeli, Brazilian, I don't know what else is out there, number 1 is more than likely going to be a sacrificial lamb. So we know that, okay? However, we have a method that allows for 3 sectors to be covered in as close to simultaneous as possible, which is the entire center of the room and then both corners simultaneously. We take that whole concept, and instead of doing it outside the threshold, we quickly transition it to inside, okay? When it's an intervention situation, which means we're under-resourced, I might be by myself. I might be in an intervention team of 12 operators, okay? So what happens here is we have the ability for 2 operators to mirror image that opening simultaneously, and they're doing it from outside the threshold. Excuse me. The secure search element to it, we are doing everything from outside, okay? But the micro nuances are all the same. We're on the threshold, muzzle is always passed. The kind of the micro applications conceptually within the different methodologies that we have, they all support a lot more the optimization, the benefits of what we're trying to do. Let me give some examples. If we are on the threshold, okay, and our rule is muzzle is past the threshold, okay, what that means is that my body's relationship with, here's the wall with the threshold, okay, my body will have a specific relationship to that wall, and then there will be a specific relationship to the wall behind me if we're talking about a hallway, all right, and it leaves space behind me. Now, if I start to open to clear and there is an engagement, we start to have rounds flying back and forth. It shouldn't be expected for me to be distracted or disrupted in any way, all right? I'm the one engaging the threat. I need to be stable, and I need to have a clear line of sight and line of fire to the threat to be able to engage effectively. Let's take, for example, let me make it a bit more specific. Let's assume we're in a hostage rescue situation, okay? And we have a team of like 30 operators. They're stealthily approaching that first room where we know or we believe there are threats and hostages. And so one of the things that I'm seeing right now that's very popular is the number 1 guy quickly, does that threshold assess where they're stepping out to the center before going in. And if we take the concept of muzzle distance from the threshold, what that means is if this is our hallway, okay, and here's my muzzle, means that my body is here. I'm eating up a lot more space in that hallway. So let's assume that I jump out to do that threshold assessment, and all of a sudden there's an engagement now, okay? I got 30 guys with me here. It's nice in theory to say that I should probably also advance. I shouldn't stay stuck there, right?
Correct. Sure.
Yeah.
In theory.
I think that's what many would argue. Okay, that I should move into that threshold while I'm engaging, or should I? Let me ask
Yeah.
you: should I advance or should I stay still and engage right from where I'm at?
Obviously, the standard, right? So the standard, with the standard existing, it becomes how fast can we put accurate rounds on this person that's trying to hurt us, and to whatever that turns out to be in whatever situation that you want to kind of like imagine yourself in, and so that has to happen first. Now, if that happens, we also have to contend with still what else might be inside of the room, right? And so the goal would be to still do the same thing, but do it all as fast as you possibly can, which is eliminate the threat and hopefully mitigate the opportunity for somebody else to hurt you by seeing as much of the room as you can before you go in still.
All right. So I agree with all the theoretical stuff that you just mentioned, but these are just theories. I want to talk kinetic tactics here. So let's translate everything you just said into what should my moves actually be. Hostage situation. We have hit that room. Okay. We're on the outside. We're stacked up. We're about to go in and take over the room. We have one or multiple threats in there. We have hostages in there. And the method is the most, and correct me if I'm wrong, but today's governing tactic in that is going to be number one, does that threshold assess, and then they all dynamically one after the other go in, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, you're correct, and that's what. Well, it's either that or they never do the threshold assessment, they never check center, and they dump into the room.
Very good, very good. So we'll talk both momentarily. The threshold assess. Let's do that first because that's what I see as being the most kind of popular out there. If I'm standing there and I get engaged, when you say take out the threat, that means that I should be engaging. But does that mean should I be moving or standing still from where I'm at?
I don't know. It's a hard question to answer, honestly. What you should be doing, I mean, it's a hard, like, you should be standing still or you should be moving. But I think, like, physiologically and just like from a hardness perspective of him trying to kill you, you moving is traditionally going to be a better option. And not only that, but it's probably going to be what your body's going to force you to do anyways, right? So if he's already shooting at you, what are you going to do? You know?
But move where?
Right.
Walk into the room?
Well, again, I would say I would caution getting into an engagement with somebody and immediately going into the room. Like you're saying, like that's what's taught, but I also believe that we can still do all these things very quickly and still do the best job that we can from outside to mitigate the chances of us getting hurt once we do cross the threshold.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you. That Burbank, California situation, the SWAT team approaching the doorway. Okay. You see the number one guy kind of take that center. Gunfire comes out. The bad guy starts to shoot at them from outside, right? Starts to shatter the glass, the entry of the bank. Everybody rushes back. And the number one guy doesn't move until there's no more shooting, right? So I personally believe, again, that if we need to take out the threat, we have to be accurate. And moving while shooting is problematic.
Correct.
I think it has a very, very limited application, which really, moving and shooting was born out of hostage rescue. That's where it came from. And everybody suddenly took it and decided it's a necessity for survival in a gunfight. Utter complete BS. Okay? And so going from here, I would say, logically speaking, you need to get into that room. Everybody needs to get into that room quickly. Is it going to happen or not? That's a different story. Okay? We know instinctively what happens. If tactically you want to take out the threat and you're not moving, you're stuck there. If instinctively you're now taking shots and instincts dictate that people will not move towards gunfire, you're not going to walk towards a gun shooting at you, we might have a problem there. Point is, I'm just trying to talk about the benefits of the muzzle at the doorway, past the threshold. And I'm not saying that in a hostage rescue situation we stick our muzzle past and then we go. That's not what happens. Okay. We take this whole package, we sneak it up to the door. When everybody's ready, we right away go inside. That's where it happens. However, I'm reverting back to tactics that are more common outside of what we do. If you have a distance between you or your muzzle and that threshold, you have rounds going back and forth here. You're limiting the ability of any of your guys getting into that equation. And I've got videos, I'm sure that you've seen, of what happens, unfortunately, guys getting shot in the back of the head when they try to enter while one of their teammates is engaging a bad guy. You know, you've got tunnel vision under stress. Add to that helmets and goggles and nods and what have you. This is your package of what you're seeing. Okay, ahead of your teammate here, suddenly jumping in without knowing exactly where your line of fire is and what have you. It's got disastrous consequences. Let's pretend that this is room number one. And as the first guy attempts to make that entry, there's gunfire and he's stuck there, but there's a distance between him and that door. And down the hall, we have another room, and the bad guys, the threats, know that we're there, and they start executing hostages. And you got 30 guys on your stack here, but you're now occupying all the space with gunfire going back and forth. Nobody can pass you. When we are on that threshold, we leave all that space empty, but behind our backs and the rest of the hall. And while I'm busy engaging, everybody else can pass me and run to the next room, which is the whole concept of hostage rescue. Take everything over as fast as possible, right? We can't have any delays. So the more that I'm discussing this, more I'm realizing it's tough to actually talk nuances and micro tactics by talking. Yeah. It'd be easier to demonstrate.
I was going to say that it's hard to imagine exactly, but to what I think you're saying is, and that's why it's hard to answer the question that you're asking me, is because I'm trying to envision myself in a particular situation, although there isn't an actual particular situation, not just in context of what's happening, but actual physical structure, right? Because, you know, if the hallway is small enough that literally only you can fit in the hallway, well, then now it's a whole nother problem, right? And that requires a whole nother solution. That's why it's kind of difficult to give you a blanket answer. But I will say a few things real quick to some of the points that you made previously, and I've said this, is that when I don't know what people teach, I really, quite honestly, I'm not paying attention. I'm so focused on what I'm trying to do. But I've always said that a CQB class, or whatever they call these classes, should start with, look, the worst thing that you could possibly do is enter a room with a guy who is ready to kill you, and he's only a danger to himself, right? But if we get to a certain point and that's what we have to do now because maybe we've checked it all or whatever, then this is what I feel like gives you the best chances at limiting the levels of destruction, right? Not the best chances of winning or surviving, because if the standard does exist, what's going to happen? It's happened recently. You know, SWAT team guys go into a room. First guy gets killed. Second guy gets shot. Third guy gets to shoot the bad guy. Right. So in that instance where whatever happened wasn't there, but we go into the room. Hey, look, this is going to help you guys limit the amount of casualties you possibly do take. Whatever that is they're teaching, I just assume that's kind of the mantra, right? I said earlier that oftentimes there's an over-resilience on marksmanship, or over-reliance on marksmanship, and I think a better way of saying that is an overconfidence that your marksmanship will be the answer to your problem, right? And so the example I kind of gave is just simply this. It's if we're in a hallway and we're standing and looking at closed doors, well, there's nothing that's going to save you from that, right? And so maybe you do have to favor cover or concealment, whatever that may be, because you just don't have an opportunity to engage anything, right? And so another one of the solution to maybe a problem like that is the story I talked about earlier, where the SWAT guys, I believe SWAT, were inside of the shed, and they essentially, what could have been an option deployed there? A shield, right? We could have taken the shield in there. Why? Because there's just so much stuff to look at. We cannot possibly cover all these angles. And so we're already moving slow. And so what does a shield afford you to do? It affords you potentially the opportunity to engage him after he engages the shield, right? They didn't have one. He got hit in the light. I'm not saying they're calling that a success, but that's another thing that they could have said, well, if we were going to go in there and we did see the blood and we were going to continue to look, what could we have done? We should have had a shield. Like, that's what they're going to say. You talked about the marksmanship piece and what happens to officers under stress. And I don't know if we've talked about this or not, but my exploiting accuracy class is essentially all the things that you talked about. And I had a class yesterday, and essentially what I do is I teach comps how to control their emotions under stress, and absent of trigger control, absent of all these mechanical things that they have to know how to do and be good at. I take cops, every single class collectively, whether it's 6 cops or 12 cops, I take them from the national average, which is 18 to 38% on the street. Their target looks like exactly how you described, right? It's everywhere, right? I eliminate all the things that make marksmanship difficult, time, distance, low light, movement, obstructions, target availability. I take all that stuff away, and within an hour, I teach them this concept and this idea, and they shoot 95 to 98% again in the area in which we're trying to hit people. And I do that without addressing anything that has to do with all these mechanical skills, trigger control, these, sight and all this, right? And so while we talk about these really important things like trigger control and your sight picture and all this, that stuff is essential. However, if you're just only pointing the gun and pulling the trigger because your attention continues to be focused, drawn to what the bad guy is doing, and the physiological responses, and you don't actually get to where you're supposed to be, then all these other things you're doing, it's irrelevant, right? I talked to a cop who got into a shooting. Bad guy was on the sidewalk. Bad guy pulled the gun from his waist, put it down to his side. Cop had his gun drawn, and about 10 feet or so, bad guy did something. Cop shot once, shot twice, like bang, bang. Shot the guy once in the chest. The next round hit the guy in the nose. And so I talked to the cop about it and asked him, what does he think happened? Why is there kind of like a disparity between the first round and the second round? I said, do you think that it's because he was falling, right? First round here, he's falling, second round there. He's like, yeah, maybe, could have been this, could have been that. He goes, but, I also didn't have a sight picture. I didn't find my dot, I'm like, okay, well, because that is the case, then we can't actually like point to any of these other mechanical things, right? Because we don't actually know what that might be. Another thing that you were talking about is in Israel, everybody has to be prepared to act at any given time to these, I would say, relatively unique situations that are particular to Israel, right? And so you said you're by yourself, you have a gun, you have to get over there and you have to do something. And that should be the mentality of cops in the United States under similar situations. And you did talk about active shooter, and I don't know the video that you were talking about. I'd like for you to send it to me, about what they were talking about, teaching the center, the guy's always in the center room, or whatever they're talking about. But the problem, at least on the U.S. side of things, is with these programs that do exist, there's too much emphasis on things that have nothing to do with getting to the bad guy and stopping the threat. Okay.
That's right.
I've been to these courses. I have an instructor certification on it. And a lot of the time you're sitting there watching a PowerPoint. You got 10, 12 officers, 20, however many go into this course. And maybe one officer ends up pulling the trigger on the bad guy. Maybe another officer does. But the majority of the course is not you, officer, are going after the bad guy. Okay. And so that's just kind of one of the major issues that I'm trying to kind of like assist with and through a course that's called Active Defender, because we know what the active shooter is doing or the active attacker is doing, but we have a hard time understanding what our responsibility is. And if you're not actually, the best thing that we have is to train as close as possible to the real thing. Okay. Whether it's blanks, whether it's simunition, that's the option that's afforded to us. And so, each individual officer, if you show up and you are part of the training, which is what's happening, you're part of it, but you're not actually involving yourself, well, then you're not actually getting any experience actually doing the thing that needs to happen in that situation. So, you talked about also a physiological response, right, at the threshold or wherever you might be, causing you to kind of move. And this happened in the class yesterday that I had, and the student asked me this. And the answer is really, it's really not that complicated to answer. Essentially, he was outside of a threshold, we'll just say, looking into the house at another threshold, waiting for the guy to come back out. He was holding, his angle as best he could. When the guy popped out and raised up his hand, the cop initially didn't fire, but kind of ducked, right? And the thing about the things that we're doing, and they get this throughout the day, they basically know kind of what's happening, but you still see the physiological responses even when it's not real. And so it's because it is not actually the actual danger. It is what the brain perceives as danger, right? And so in that same situation, that bad guy could have came out with anything that wasn't a gun and did that, and they would have likely done something similar. That's what they see. So he goes, so was this bad? Like, should I have stayed here? I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do in that situation. Your body is going to tell you what makes sense. And look, here's the deal. He's coming out being completely indiscriminate about what he's trying to do, right? He has no rules of engagement. He doesn't care. He might not even completely show himself, give you something that you can hit. And so by the time he's pointing a gun at you, you're still trying to figure out what it is. And maybe you actually don't have enough time to make a decision, and the better option is to kind of move out of the way. And so I don't like to tell them, you will do this or you should do this. And I think that maybe is kind of contrary to like what people see that and go, oh, you need to stay in the fight. You need to stay there. Well, I mean, maybe that's just the best option. I said, maybe you ducked out of the way because you were still trying to figure out what it was, and the round hit the wall, where you were standing. And so there's that aspect. We talked about it several times already, which is like the drywall won't protect you. Okay, we got it. We understand that it possibly will not do that for us. And then here's the other default thing that they go to whenever they see somebody going slow, and it's this: speed, surprise, and violence of action. Okay. And that is like the mantra, and that is essentially the answer to all the problems, I guess, right? And so, look, when you, I guess my question is, look, at what point have we lost the speed or the surprise, right? Almost always in law enforcement, we don't really have it. Even in the military, when you're flying in on a Black Hawk and you're landing inside the compound, like, I don't know how much surprise you have at that point, right? Military operations, you're inside an urban area and they know that you're kind of coming that direction. So, there's a video. I tried to find the original. I can't find it, so I don't want to post it yet. But a SWAT team basically hits this house, and the bad guy, or I say bad guy, he's just a guy in the house, but he's in the back room. And as soon as they announce and they hit the door open, and I think they throw flashbangs, he kind of moves down the hallway into that room and shuts the door. And he is literally walking in circles, like nervous, trying to figure out kind of what to do. He had no intentions of like trying to hurt them, I guess. But you put it on a timer. I don't know what it was, 7 seconds, we'll say 12 seconds. But I think that, again, built primarily on the guy was never going to fight anyway, right? The guy had no intention of fighting. And so we did all these things to get here really quick. And because it ended peacefully, then we say, okay, speed, surprise, and violence of action, that worked, right? It's like, well, the guy was dancing around the room for 10 seconds. If there was a gun there and you wanted to hurt you, he could have grabbed it and waited for you. I've been part of, instances where, on a vehicle takedown where the takedown occurs, the guy is literally giving up, right? And we kind of know based on these vehicle takedowns, if the guy's going to fight, it's going to happen usually within the first couple seconds because they're like, oh, it's the cops, let me get out of here. And so the vehicle containment happens. The guy's hands are coming out the window. We throw a couple flashbangs, right? And I'm not saying don't throw them. I'm not saying why not. But the problem is that afterwards, everybody's like, yeah, those were effective. Those were great. That was awesome. And I'm like, well, the guy was giving up. You know what I mean? So we kind of like build those expectations up of what actually works based off guys who were never going to fight anyways. And in this book, one of the books that I have behind me, Surviving Police Tactics, there's a story in there, and it actually mentions that exact thing, where cops were basically doing a, kind of in a way mentions that, but they were doing a warrant or something. Cop went down. They basically got out of there. I don't know what happened to the cop, but the point is that after that happened, that team or that organization basically started an officer down school or drill or course or whatever and went around teaching that thing. And the point that they make in that book is everybody wants to find a solution to like, a problem that they may have created, but nobody questions whether or not they should have even gone into the house to begin with. Right. And which is kind of to the point of the things that you said about, hey, why are these guys? We have a lot of guys that are getting hurt. Why are we doing that?
Talked about speed, surprise, violence of action. Those are ingredients. Those are not tactics. And this is why I go back to what I talked about at the beginning. if you don't clearly define, right, if everything is just CQB, you're going to be lost in the sea of what you're doing. You have to clearly define the mission profile. As soon as you know what the mission profile is it a hostage rescue? Is it a hostage rescue in a domestic environment, a friendly environment that we can control everything outside the building? Is it a hostage rescue in a hostile environment where we have to sneak in unknown, execute this hostage rescue, and then get out? Is it a warrant execution in a controlled environment, a warrant execution in a hostile environment? Is it an active shoot? If you don't define every single one of those profiles, you're going to be misappropriating a lot of things. The moment that I know that, okay, we're going in to arrest a bad guy who is in a building, who is, in a neighborhood that we can control. There's no threats outside of that building or that house, that structure, whatever it is. It right away tells me my mode of application operation, what my approach is going to be, how we're going to breach the door. If I have to sneak into a hostile neighborhood or a hostile country to go and grab a high value target, to go and rescue a hostage, I can't let anybody know that I'm coming, let alone that I'm already there on the ground. So I got to make sure that we can breach quietly. I got to make sure that we are moving in quietly. I got to know what the hinges on the door are. Is it going to creak when I open it up? You got to know, to the micro bit, everything, right? If all of a sudden a shot rings out and there's a potential that that sound is going to leave the structure and it's going to alert the whole neighborhood, that also now puts a whole different protocol into place. So speed, surprise, violence of action, you can look at that on a micro level, which is at least I know that at the beginning 20 years ago when I was trained on SWAT tactics, speed, surprise, violence of action was how we take a room. Those are the ingredients to take a room so we dominate, overwhelm a threat who's in there waiting for us, which that's not how you overwhelm them. You're not going to surprise them out of, facing a different direction the majority of the time. You can maybe apply that on a macro level to an entire building, an entire situation. But what does that really mean? It still all boils down to how are you moving? What are the kinetics? What are the mechanics physically, tactically? How are you opening a door? How are you moving through? Like speed, surprise, balance of action, that is just, it's a concept. The most applicable is that they are ingredients, but those will not create the tactics. The tactics have to be based on what your mission profile is, what your objective is, what you can and can't do, what you can have happen as a result of what you do, and what you must not let happen as a result of what you do, right? So that's, again, where I think that there's just so much that is lost because of this whole notion of CQB, that people kind of stray away from what the actual objective is, what the mission is. Focus on that. You build the strategies and the tactics around that,
Yeah, I agree. And one more thing, the Code Over Country book, what happens in there is the commander, whoever's in charge, essentially tells this group of SEALs or whoever, special forces guys, that they are now going to do surrounding call outs in country, right? Because the civilians were complaining to their government that they were killing civilians, right? And so what ended up happening, of course, was that once they switched to the surrounding call out, or were forced to, based on these complaints, less people were being killed, right? And so that's one interesting aspect to that. I think there's a time and a place, obviously, for everything, and there is no one answer to a number of different problems.
Yes.
But I think that it's important for people to be exposed to whatever they can be exposed to and understand, like you're saying, like the applicability to every situation, right? I heard somebody say one time, we don't want to find the best solution to every tactical problem. We want everybody to just learn this one way. And I kind of took that as like the worst thing that any tactical person could, have to contemplate and reason with, having to do something in a situation is wrong, but you have to do it because we have this standard way of doing it. But what I usually say is that I don't believe in sacrificing poor tactics for anything. So regardless of the speed at which we're moving, if we're going slow, if we're going fast, still do everything you can to accomplish the mission, but try to do it not from a personal I want to go home perspective, but does it meet the criteria of, if the standard is in here, what is the fastest way that we could put accurate rounds on this person? And if that's the standard and that's the way that you develop your tactics, then in my opinion, you kind of have to be on the right track at least.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, a starting point would be, I guess, maybe munitions, but with no protective gear. I think that will, the guys, that are playing the good guys outside the threshold, it might suddenly shift their mindset on how they do things. Maybe, I don't know, right? I mean, I've been shoveling enough sims. I know that it's a bitch and it hurts and I don't like it, but a lot of all of the methodologies and tactics out there are based on training theories and concepts. And there's no trade-off in that. There's no actual trade-off. In real life, we go into a room and it wasn't the most optimal. And again, granted that we could be doing the right thing, but luck is not on our side that day. That's just a roll of the dice that we all face. There's nothing you can do about that, right? God bless everybody in uniform who at least tries. But when it's a situation where we've got more variables in our control, knowing that if we are not actually doing everything optimally, we might die. It changes thinking. It changes everything, yeah, I don't know. I know there's a you mentioned something that a thought crossed to mind about there seems to be a race out there. Everybody wants to reach this like benchmark of having done 1,000 entries in their tenure on a tactical team, right? I've not done 1,000 real entries in my entire career, I'll call it, between all my service in real life. I've done probably 100,000 entries collectively in the last 27, 28 years. But of course, that's mixed in with training stuff and the whole bit. I know that I have, over the years, had the opportunity to speak with people, whether they're recruits, students, whether they were cross-training situations, or incidentally, people that I met who served in different units and everything. And I've, spoken with the guys that have been all over the world, have done all the things that they write books about these days, and that have done, the 1,000 entries. And then I've also spoken with, the guy who has only done one entry. And when he went into that room, he got shot up. And you can already see and feel the difference in approach and thinking, between both that represent those two scenarios. So I agree with you. Everything has to be based on the ultimate standard, and we got to stop fooling ourselves. We have to stop patting ourselves on the back. We have to stop trying to be our own biggest fans. We have to first be our own worst enemies. We have to challenge everything that we think is right, everything that we're doing in the most realistic way, the way that a threat would challenge us. A threat wants us dead, without any leeway, without any nothing. And everything has to be based on that first and foremost, and then we got to evolve from there.
I think the best way of thinking about it is, like we've talked about several probably times on here already, is the interest should be just in what do we think is the best thing to be doing for whatever that situation is, versus who is providing the information and whose information is more valuable than the other person's information. And I think that also is what I've learned is, for whatever reason, it becomes more about people for some reason, not like everybody out there. It becomes more about, well, me and my stuff, and that stuff is no good, versus, well, let's just talk about what the best way of doing these things are. So, because I think the ultimate goal is that when human beings find themselves in these situations, they make the right decision with a high degree of accountability, and everybody is safer for whatever that decision is. Anyways, was a long conversation, kind of choppy because we had to start over, all kinds of stuff. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and spending this time with me and with us. We wish you the best of luck going forward, and hope that we can get you back on here to talk about many more topics of conversation, so that this conversation and many other conversations like this can happen, while also kind of removing the emotional aspect from these kinds of conversations.
It's my absolute pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here with you and talk about what we love.